So mostly what I've been talking about so far is, do civilians cooperate with police officers? And what I want to now do is turn the tables and ask whether police cooperate with civilians. Because it turns out in these encounters, civilians initiate a lot of actions on their own. They pose questions, they raise challenges, make complaints, and so forth. And as I mentioned in talking about the overall structural organization of the encounter, the actions they initiate have a different kind of status in these encounters. First of all, there's no place for them. In some institutional encounters, there's a place for you to have your say. You know, what do you think about this? And then you get to say what you think. But in police encounters, there's no structurally provided opportunity for participation. So civilians have to find a place to work these in. And when they do, they're often experienced by the police officer as delaying or impeding what the police officer is trying to do. They're getting in the way of the thing the police officer is trying to do. So they're resisting a directive or questioning the legitimacy of the encounter or some action in it. They pursue something outside of the encounter. They're experienced as impediments to the police officer's project. And so police tend to view them as distracting, as disruptive, and so forth. But these are the methods that civilians have for legally shaping the trajectory of these encounters. If you're a civilian and you want to shape what happens in the encounter, if you want to do anything other than just cooperate, initiating an action relative to the officer is the way you have to get that done legally. There are other ways. They're not legal. They'll just get you in trouble. You can try and use force if you'd like, but it's not very effective. So what we wanted to know is, do police respond to these initiating actions, and how do they respond to these initiating actions? Because we started to see that how police responded to civilians was massively consequential for how civilians responded to police. So there are different options. Police can acknowledge civilian participation by responding to the substance of that initiating action. So if somebody asks a question, they can answer it. Or they can just acknowledge it by saying, I understand you have a question. We'll get to that in a little bit, but first I need you to do this. So they can acknowledge those initiating actions in some way. Or they can ignore, suppress, or reject the civilian participation. For example, by persisting in doing what they've been doing before. So a civilian asks a question and they just keep saying, sit down, sit down, sit down. So that's ignoring what's going on or suppressing it. They can interrupt what somebody's doing, or they can say something like, I don't care. Do you think I care about that camera on me? Right, so these are different ways of rejecting or suppressing or ignoring civilian participation. And what we noticed is that quite regularly when police use force, it's because there are two competing courses of action going on. The police are trying to do one thing and the civilians trying to do something else, like with the offer to sit down. They were about the same thing, but they were both trying to do something, and that was the source of trouble. So let me just show you what we coded and talk a little bit about this data. So this is an encounter of a disturbance at a convenience store. When the police arrive, they're met by a young African-American man out in the parking lot who reports that there's a white couple inside who have used a racial epithet and tried to start a fight with them. So the police go inside to investigate this. And when the police go inside, they find a white couple and another young African-American male inside the store. And this is what happens. CM2 is civilian male 2. That's the other African-American male that's in this encounter. Here's what happens.
Hey, officer, I have no issue with drug use. I'm the one that's down there. Okay,
Hey, he's cool though, please don't give me a name.
okay, I'm coming outside, sir, right now. I didn't even quit.
No, he's
All right, let me find out. Let me find out, all right?
All right, so they end up coming out with the African-American male with his arm behind his back, being pushed out, and the white couple trailing behind. I haven't talked a lot about race so far in this talk, but as one of the issues we're very interested in this, I'm just going to make a sort of footnote here. So now one of the things we're observing is that especially young African-American males orient to an increased vulnerability to police suspicion, so they anticipate that police will treat them as suspects. And that often turns out to be quite correct, as happens in this case. So that's a side project. We can talk more about that in the question and answer session. But now I just want to know, what are the things we're coding? So we get, hey, honestly, sir, I have no issue. So he initiates a course of action, and the officer responds with, let's go outside. So not a response to that, but some other kind of thing. And that persists. And I'll just forward it here. What I want to notice is you get two competing projects. This guy is trying to establish before they go outside that he's just a witness. And he wants to do that because he doesn't want to end up outside as a potential suspect. So before they go anywhere, he wants to establish, I'm a witness. The police, however, want to get them outside because if they assume that if they open up a discussion about who's involved in what way, they're back into the fight, and so they're going to have a fight in the store. And so before they talk about who's involved in what way, this guy's going to get them outside, and so that's why he's pushing this course of action. So we have two competing courses of action in which both parties anticipate that participating in the other person's course of action is going to open up the very trajectory that their own course of action tries to avoid. So they're in a standoff where each of them figures cooperating with the other is going to be a problem. And so that's the basis for the civilian resistance here. And so I just want to notice it's not arbitrary or capricious. He's not just, throwing it in the officer's face. He's trying to get something done, okay? And the way that this is resolved, so as often happens when you get these competing courses of action, then different people in the scene start to align on, I'm going to go with this course of action, I'm going to go with this course of action. So you get some civilians aligning with this guy, he's cool. You get the other officer aligning with the first police officer. So you get an emergence of factions pursuing these competing courses of action. And of course, force is the way that the officer resolves this. Okay, here's another instance of the sort of thing we're coding. In this case, a civilian stopped for jaywalking becomes combative when the officer won't tell him why he's been stopped. And so we're going to pick up the encounter after this guy is well and truly upset. And we'll see what happens.
Maybe let's take my two cars as well. Maybe let's take out my fucking car. Sit down. My fucking green car. Sit down, sure. Go ahead, take out my fucking car. Sit down. Go ahead, be my ass. Be a fucking asshole. Very clear. Be your asshole. I need to fucking bullshit. You're gonna sit down on the ground. No, I don't think so. Don't fucking do it. Fucking
All right, so again, what we have is a civilian pursuing a set of questions, in this case kind of these combative questions. You want to check this, you want to check that. And in each case, the officer's doing something completely different, pursuing a sit-down sort of thing. So you have competing projects. This one, although I think that the civilian probably not helping himself out here, there's an issue of what the police officer might do differently. But what I want to suggest here is these questions suggest the loss of authority by the police officer. The civilian is not treating him anymore as a legitimate authority, has begun to treat him as something, as exercising something like arbitrary power. And so his resistance is premised on that. So that's another kind of thing we're coding. Sorry, you can see what we've coded as suppressions or ignoring here. This is the last case I'll show you on this. This one turns out slightly different. This is a case where the police have been called to a fight outside of a bar, and it turns out it's a fight between a brother and a sister, both of whom are now being arrested. And during that time, another brother shows up to try and talk to the police officer who are arresting his sister to try and get them to go more easy on her. They don't need to be so tough. And so another police officer comes to get him out of there. So that's the encounter we're going to look at, trying to get this young man away from the site of the arrest to another place. And what we'll see is he's trying to explain why he's still involved in this other encounter. And the police officer is trying to get him not involved in that encounter. So again, they're working at cross purposes. So here's what happens.
Sit down. Sit down. On the ground. Okay, we'll figure it out tonight. Sit down.
I'm down.
No, on your ass against the wall.
Sit down my ass.
Okay, I get that, but until we get this figured out, you can't be pestering everybody. Until someone talks to you, you chill out, okay?
I understand.
Thank you.
All right, so we have a cooperative outcome here. And one of the things I want to notice is a difference in the way this officer responded, and that is by saying something like, I understand that you have this issue, We'll get to that in a bit, and then resuming your course of action. So just acknowledging what this civilian was trying to accomplish was enough to get him to temporarily abandon it, and then they resume the sitting and deal with some problems associated with whether he's actually sitting down, and they end up coming out of this cooperatively. So we had these hypotheses. We said, we think that when police officers acknowledge, register, or respond to the initiating actions that civilians produce, they're more likely to cooperate in these discrete courses of action, and you're more likely to get cooperative resolutions of the projects that the police are engaged in. And by contrast, where police officers actively suppress or ignore these initiating actions, civilians are less likely to cooperate and in these discrete courses of action, and you're likely to get a lower rate of cooperative completion of the projects. You're more likely to get projects completed via force. So we coded about 40 videos. This gives you a sense of the number of instances. So there are 300 some chances to respond, 806 opportunities to comply, and the like. So you get a sense of the numbers here that we looked at. If you look at how these suppressions are distributed, 20 of the encounters, there's no suppression at all. There's no problem. Everything's cooperative. But in 21 of the encounters, you have between 1 and 55 suppressions, and in some encounters you can see you get a huge number of suppressed actions or ignored actions, and in others you get a few. So what we did was we made some transformations to, and I'm going to defer to Christian on the quantitative part of this, to make the function of these acknowledgments approximately symmetric. We did some transformations to the numbers, and we created a binary variable. We said if there's two or fewer suppressions, we think that that's not probably consequential. But if there's 3 or more suppressions, it is. And there's a reason for that we can go into in the discussion if you'd like. Analytic reasons for thinking more than 2 is an important number. And we also did some transformation to reduce the varying impact, or the impact of varying lengths of the encounter and other kinds of outliers. We tried to make the numbers honest, as it were. And here's the result. We did a logistic regression on this to estimate the probability of project completion. And it turns out the odds of a cooperatively achieved outcome increase by 20 times if police officers respond to civilian initiating actions. It is a significant impact. You have a chance of error of 0.002. So this was far more this was far more orderly and systematic than we would have ever anticipated. We were hoping for that there would be some impact, but we didn't think that we would have this big of an impact. So if you look at the probability, if police officers suppress more than 3 initiating actions, the chance of them resolving the encounter cooperatively is down to 23%. I mean, they're very, very unlikely to come out of that with, much less likely to come out of it with a cooperative outcome than if they actually respond to what civilians are doing. And we think part of that relationship has to do with where civilians are initiating these initiating actions. That is, they're producing it at times when police are trying to get something else done, and so you get the kind of conflict. We also wanted to know, does it matter, do we see a relationship to the overall cooperativeness of civilians? And it turns out, so we created a kind of rate of noncompliance where we took the number of opportunities for cooperation as a denominator, and then took pursuits, that's when a police officer is trying to get someone to cooperate, and completions by force. Those are 2 kinds of evidence that civilians aren't cooperating. So we used that to create a measure of cooperativeness, and we did the same kind of transformations to the numbers to diminish the impact of outliers. And it turns out that if you do a linear regression, the rate of non-cooperation is significant. So when police officers suppress or ignore initiating actions, that dominates a civilian's willingness to cooperate, and so you get a very high rate of non-cooperation. If the officers do acknowledge some more actions, that slightly decreases the impact of that effect. It's a kind of borderline case, whereas if officers acknowledge what civilians are doing, you get a very high rate of cooperation. So this looks like it works across the entire encounter as well. So we took these two hypotheses and we wanted to know, does it matter whether police respond to civilian initiating actions? And the answer is yes, it's highly significant. We confirm both hypotheses. The odds of a cooperatively achieved outcome increases by 20 times if officers don't suppress civilian initiating actions. Acknowledgements were not as significant, they were kind of borderline, but the point here is you can't choose, you can't avoid choosing. You either have to acknowledge what somebody's doing or you ignore it or suppress it. So another way of putting that is, you don't get a lot of credit for responding to initiating actions, but you pay a really high price if you don't. So there are real consequences to not responding to what civilians are trying to get done. When we think about putting these findings into practice, one kind of question that we get often from police officers, and I think it's a pretty reasonable one, is what about when civilians are doing something stupid? You know, what about when the questions they ask are dumb? You know, like, you want to look at my card, what about these kind of obnoxious actions? Don't those matter? Isn't that the reason police aren't responding to these initiating actions? And our response is, that may be true, but in our data, the police ignored or suppressed a very wide range of actions, including offers to cooperate, protestations of innocence, and other kinds of things. So clearly that's not all that's going on. And even if the questions are stupid, it may turn out that responding to them is a far more effective way of getting their compliance than ignoring them. Because when you ignore or suppress what the civilians are trying to do, you end up with an escalating conflict that leads to other kinds of trouble. So you may not like the question, but this is the person you're dealing with, and so if you deal with them, you might find that the outcome is very different. The other thing I want to notice is they don't have to answer every question. As we saw in one of the exemplary videos I showed you, just acknowledging that someone has a project was enough in some cases to get somebody to temporarily abandon it. Of course, to the extent that the police officers are concerned about establishing trust and credibility, going back and giving them the chance that you promised them earlier. You said, yeah, we'll talk about that later. You got to actually give them the chance later, or else you'll just confirm someone's worst fears about them. So we think about putting these practices into work. I want to think about how officers manage trouble in these encounters. Because one of the things that they found in the medical encounters was that by the time a problem emerges, the range of ways that a doctor has for managing it are very limited. So, if somebody's going to pressure you to prescribe medication, if they're pressuring you, you now have to confront that dilemma head on. You're far better off if you do something early on that projects you're not going to prescribe antibiotics, for example, if that's the problem, to diminish the likelihood that the problem will ever crop up. So instead of waiting for a problem to emerge and then addressing it at that point, are there things that police officers could do early on in the encounter so that you don't get these problems of non-cooperation? And we think there are a range of things that police officers could do to make it less likely that they'll encounter some of these problems that we're seeing in terms of civilians initiating action. So they have a bunch of opportunities early on to promote cooperation, police officers do. They can use things like explanations. Explanations turn out to be massively effective in getting people to cooperate with things that they don't otherwise want to do. There's an interesting study coming out of Harvard where people asked to cut in line at a photocopying table, a photocopying machine. So they just walked up to somebody who's making photocopies and said, hey, can I make my copies before you? And about 40% of the time people said, okay. But if the person said, hey, I need to make can I make photocopies before you? I really need to make some copies. The rate of cooperation went up to 93%. So just the appearance of an explanation, doesn't even have to have a real explanation, just seeming like you're explaining promotes cooperation. So using explanations, probably going to matter. We also think that how officers design their directives, whether they use, how officers design these actions, whether they use directives versus requests or other kinds of things, is going to matter. There's, of course, a bunch of practices for establishing rapport. And so we're coding data along these lines to see just how effective these other kinds of things are in preventing the emergence of trouble in the first place. But we're pretty happy that this first practice we focused on, this first method for reducing the use of force, looks like it might be pretty effective. So, thank you.